The room was quiet in a way that made even the smallest sound feel loud. A slow ceiling fan turned above, pushing warm air in lazy circles. Papers lay stacked in uneven piles across a long wooden table, some yellow with age, others curling at the edges as if they had been waiting too long to be noticed again. He sat alone, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, one hand holding a pencil that he kept tapping without thinking. It was late, far later than he had planned to stay, but leaving did not feel like an option anymore. Not tonight. He had come to Cairo with a simple goal. At least, that was what he told himself. He wanted to organize old excavation records, review forgotten notes, and maybe find something small that others had missed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would change anything. But now, as he flipped through another brittle page, he felt that quiet sense of curiosity growing into something stronger. The document in front of him was dated over 100 years ago. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes rushed, sometimes careful. It described daily habits of ancient Egyptians, but not in the way most books did. These notes did not talk about kings or battles or grand temples. They focused on ordinary things, small things, strange things. He frowned slightly as he read a line again. Subjects observed shaving entire body repeatedly, even in absence of visible need. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the sentence. It sounded unnecessary, extreme, even. Why would anyone do that? And not just once, but regularly? He turned the page. Another note followed. Use of hardened headrests during sleep. Stone or wood. No soft support. This time, he let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. Sleeping on stone? That sounded uncomfortable at best, painful at worst. It made no sense. But what caught his attention wasn't just the content. It was the tone. The writer did not sound confused or amused. Instead, there was a sense of observation, almost respect, as if these actions were not random habits, but something worth understanding. He leaned forward again, now fully focused. Outside, the city had grown quieter. The distant hum of traffic had softened, replaced by the occasional passing car or a faint voice somewhere far below. The world beyond the building felt distant, like it belonged to another time. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. He continued reading. There were mentions of wax cones placed on people's heads during gatherings. The notes described them slowly melting over time, releasing scented oils. At first, he imagined it as some kind of decoration, maybe a symbol of status or beauty. But the writer had added something unusual. Possible practical function. Substance unclear. Further study required. He paused again. Practical function? That phrase stayed in his mind longer than anything else. He flipped through more pages, faster now, scanning for patterns. There were notes about cleanliness that seemed almost obsessive. Instructions about washing, shaving, and maintaining the body in very specific ways. Mentions of oils and mixtures used on the skin, not just for appearance but for protection. Protection from what? He tapped the pencil against the table again, slower this time. At first, all of it seemed excessive. Strange habits from a distant time. But the more he read, the more he felt something shift in his thinking. What if these things weren't strange at all? What if they only seemed strange because he didn't understand them yet? He closed the folder gently and leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned. The steady motion helped him think. Ancient Egypt was not an easy place to live. The heat alone could be overwhelming. The dust, the insects, the constant exposure to sun. Life there required adaptation. He knew that much, but most of what he had studied focused on the big picture. Architecture, religion, leadership. Not the everyday choices people made just to stay comfortable or even just to survive. Maybe that was the missing piece. He sat up again and opened the folder once more, this time with a different mindset. Instead of asking why these customs were strange, he started asking a different question. What problem were they trying to solve? The thought felt simple, almost obvious, but it changed everything. He turned back to the note about shaving. In a hot climate, with limited access to modern hygiene tools, body hair could trap sweat, dirt, and insects. It could lead to discomfort, even disease. Removing it suddenly didn't seem so extreme. It seemed practical. He flipped to another page. the headrests, sleeping on stone or what sounded harsh. But what if soft materials were not ideal in that environment? Fabric could hold heat, attract insects, or wear out quickly. A solid surface, shaped carefully, might actually keep the head cool. It might even protect hairstyles or prevent certain issues. He nodded slowly, the idea beginning to settle. Then there were the wax cones. He picked up that page again, reading it more carefully. If the cone contained scented oils, they might not just be for smell. Some natural oils could repel insects. As they melted, they would spread across the hair and skin. A slow release system. He raised his eyebrows slightly. That wasn't just practical. That was clever. He leaned back again, this time with a small smile forming. The feeling in the room had changed. What had started as mild curiosity was now something deeper. There was a pattern here, a logic, and it had been overlooked. He stood up and walked toward the window, pushing it open slightly. A warm breeze drifted in, carrying distant sounds from the city. He rested his hands on the frame and looked out. Light stretched across the horizon, mixed with shadows and quiet streets. Somewhere beyond all of that lay the Nile, the same river that had shaped life in this region for thousands of years. People back then had lived with this environment every single day. They had learned from it, adapted to it. He wondered how many of their solutions had been forgotten, simply because they looked unusual to modern eyes. He returned to the table and began organizing the papers more carefully. This was no longer just a task to complete. It was something worth following. Each note, each observation, felt like a small piece of a larger picture, and he wanted to see that picture clearly. He found another set of pages tucked beneath the main folder. These were different, more detailed. They included sketches and short descriptions of daily routines. One drawing showed a group of people sitting together, each with a small cone on their head. Another showed tools used for shaving, simple but effective. There were also notes about water usage, storage methods, and ways of keeping living spaces clean. Again, the same pattern appeared. Everything had a purpose. Nothing felt random anymore. He sat down and began writing in his own notebook, carefully copying the most important points. He didn't want to lose track of anything. Not now. Time passed without him noticing. The fan continued its slow rotation. The air grew slightly cooler as the night deepened. The stack of papers on the table became more organized, more meaningful. At some point, he realized he was no longer tired. In fact, he felt more awake than he had all day. There was something exciting about uncovering a new way of looking at something old. It felt like finding a hidden message that had been there all along. He paused his writing and looked at the notes spread out before him. For years, these documents had been ignored. Maybe people had read them briefly and dismissed them as unimportant details. Strange habits that didn't matter, but they did matter. They told a different story, not about kings or monuments, but about people, real people, living in a challenging environment, finding ways to make their lives better. That was the story he wanted to understand, and maybe, eventually, the story he wanted to tell. He closed his notebook and sat still for a moment, letting the silence settle again. There was a long road ahead. More research, more questions, more connections to uncover. But for the first time since arriving, he felt certain about something. He had found something worth chasing. Something that could change the way people saw the past. He reached for the next folder, already knowing he wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. The night stretched on, quiet and steady, as he continued reading, thinking, and slowly piecing together forgotten logic that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The morning came slowly, with soft light slipping through the thin curtains and spreading across the room. He had not slept much. The chair beside the table was still slightly pushed back, and his notebook lay open where he had left it. Pages filled with quick notes, arrows, and small circles marked the places he wanted to return to. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything from a night before. But as soon as he looked at the table, covered with old papers and marked pages, the feeling returned. There was something important here, something that didn't fit the usual story. He washed his face, grabbed his bag, and stepped out into the street. The air was already warm, carrying the smell of dust and the distant sound of traffic building up. People moved around him with purpose. Shop owners opening their doors, workers heading to jobs, and small groups talking as they walked. Life felt fast outside, but his mind was still back in that quiet room. He made his way toward a small local office connected to an old excavation site near the Nile. It wasn't a place most visitors would notice. The building was simple, almost hidden between larger structures, but he had been told that someone there might help him understand more about the daily life records he had found. Inside, the air was cooler. Shelves lined the walls, filled with files, books, and small labeled boxes. A man sat behind a desk, reading something with full focus. He looked up as the door opened. They greeted each other briefly, and after a few minutes of explanation, the conversation turned to the notes. He pulled out copies of the pages he had been studying and placed them on the desk. The man glanced over them, then leaned back slightly. "These are not the kind of notes most people ask about," he said calmly. "That's exactly why I'm here," he replied. There was a short pause, followed by a small nod. "Then you're looking in the right direction," the man said. They spent the next hour going through the notes one by one. Some of the practices were familiar to the man, others less so. But what mattered was how he explained them, not as strange habits, but as parts of system, a way of living. When they reached the part about shaving, the man gave a simple explanation. "In that heat, with that environment, hair becomes a problem," he said. "It holds sweat, attracts insects, and can lead to skin trouble. Removing it makes life easier." He said it so plainly that it almost felt obvious. The same happened with the wax cones. They were not just for scent, the man explained. Some oils used in those times had natural properties. They helped keep insects away. They also kept the skin from drying too much in the sun. Again, practical. Again, logical. He listened carefully, asking questions, writing down every detail. The more he learned, the more the pieces started to connect. By the time he left the office, the sun was high, and the streets were louder. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt focused. There was only one way to understand this fully. He had to see more. Over the next few days, he traveled along the Nile, stopping at different sites and small research centers. Some were active excavation areas. Others were quiet places where old discoveries were stored and studied. Each stop added something new. At one site, he watched as workers carefully cleaned tools that had been found buried for centuries. Among them were small blades, shaped in a way that made them easy to hold and use. They were used for shaving, one worker explained. Very sharp, very simple. He picked one up carefully, studying its shape. It was not decorative. It was not symbolic. It was made to do a job. At another location, he saw preserved objects that had once been part of daily life. Small containers for oils, combs, and what looked like early forms of grooming kits. Everything pointed to the same idea. Cleanliness mattered, not in a casual way, but in a serious, almost structured way. He began to notice something else too. Many of these practices were shared across different levels of society. They were not limited to the rich or powerful. Ordinary people followed them as well. That made it even more interesting. These were not luxury habits. They were necessary ones. One afternoon, while visiting a quiet storage area, he came across a display of headrests. They were arranged in a row, each one slightly different in shape and size. He had read about them, but seeing them in person was different. They were solid, smooth, and carefully shaped to support the neck. Some were made of wood, others of stone. None looked soft or comfortable in the way modern pillows did. A woman working nearby notices interest. "Most people think they look uncomfortable," she said with a small smile. "They do," he admitted. "But think about the environment," she continued. "Soft materials trap heat. They also wear out quickly. These keep the head raised, allow air to move, and last a very long time." He nodded slowly. When explained like that, it made sense. More than sense. It felt smart. He moved along the display, noticing how each piece had small differences. Some were wider, some more curved. It suggested that people had preferences, just like today. Even in something as simple as sleep, there was thought and care. Later that day, he sat by the river, watching the water move steadily. Boats passed by slowly, and the sound of the current created a calm rhythm. He opened his notebook again. Pages were now filled with observations, sketches, and questions. But one thing stood out clearly. The idea of weird no longer fit. These customs were not strange. They were responses. Responses to heat, to insects, to limited resources, to daily challenges. And in many cases, they were effective. He thought about how easily people dismiss things that look different, how quickly something is labeled as odd without understanding the reason behind it. He had done the same at first, but now he saw it differently. Over the next few days, he focused on gathering more detailed information. He spoke to more experts, visited more locations, and compared notes from different sources. Some of the most interesting information came from small, almost overlooked details. For example, he learned that certain oils used by ancient Egyptians were not chosen randomly. Many came from plants that had specific properties. Some helped protect the skin, others kept insects away, and some even helped with minor wounds. It was not guesswork. It was knowledge built over time. He also found references to cleaning routines that were surprisingly advanced. Regular washing, the use of natural substances to clean the body, and attention to living spaces. In a place where disease could spread quickly, these habits made a difference. One evening, while reviewing his notes, he noticed how often the same idea appeared. Balance. Everything seemed to be about balance, between the body and the environment, between comfort and practicality, between tradition and function. Nothing felt excessive anymore. It all had a purpose. He closed his notebook and leaned back, thinking about how to bring all of this together. This was no longer just about listing strange customs. It was about telling a different story. A story where people were not simply following traditions, but actively solving problems. A story where intelligence showed itself in quiet, everyday actions. He looked around the room he was staying in. It was simple, with only the things he needed. A bed, a small table, a chair, and a window. For the first time, he thought about how many of his own habits were shaped by convenience rather than need. Modern life had made many things easier, but it had also made people less aware of why they did what they did. That thought stayed with him. As the days passed, his understanding grew deeper. He no longer saw separate customs. He saw a system, a way of living that was built on observation, experience, and adaptation. And the more he learned, the more he realized something surprising. Many of these ideas were still relevant today. People were rediscovering natural oils, focusing on hygiene, and looking for simple solutions to everyday problems. In some ways, they were coming back to the same answers, just in a different form. He smiled slightly at that thought. History wasn't just something in the past. It was something that continued to shape the present, often without people noticing. One night, as he sat reviewing everything he'd gathered, he felt a quiet sense of clarity. This was only the beginning. There were still more details to uncover, more connections to make, and deeper meanings to understand. But the direction was clear. What once seemed strange now felt familiar. What had once been dismissed now felt important. And what had once been hidden was slowly coming into view. He closed his notebook once again, this time with a sense of purpose that felt stronger than before. The story was growing, and he was ready to follow it wherever it led next. By the time the next week began, his routine had changed completely. He no longer moved through his days like a visitor. Instead, he moved with purpose, as if each hour carried something waiting to be uncovered. The early excitement had settled into a steady focus. He was no longer surprised by every strange detail he found. Instead, he expected there to be a reason behind it. And more often than not, there were gaps. Some customs made sense quickly, almost immediately. Others took time. They required patience, comparison, and sometimes a second or third look before anything became clear. One morning, he sat in a quiet study room, surrounded by books and copied records. A soft light came through a high window, falling across the table where it spread out several pages side by side. These pages all mention preservation, not the grand kind that people usually talk about, not the detailed processes used for kings and tombs, but something simpler, early methods, basic steps, and small action that seemed almost ordinary. At first, He had skipped past them. Now, he returned to them with fresh attention. He read slowly, underlining certain phrases. Care of the body after death. Use of natural substances. Attempts to slow change. He paused and tapped the pencil lightly. Why would ordinary people care so much about preservation? It couldn't only be belief. There had to be something more. He leaned back, thinking carefully. In a place with intense heat, bodies would change quickly, without any form of control. That process would be fast and difficult to manage. It would affect not just rituals, but daily life, especially in close communities. Simple preservation methods could have helped manage that. It wasn't about perfection. It was about control. That idea stayed with him as he continued reading. Later that day, he visited a small research space connected to a university. It was quieter than most places he had been, with only a few people working inside. Shelves were filled with labeled items, and tables held tools and materials used for study. He spoke with a researcher who focused on ancient materials. Their conversation moved slowly, carefully, as they looked at different records and samples. When he brought up the idea of early preservation, the researcher nodded. People often think of it only as ritual, the researcher said. But there are practical sides too. Managing the body, controlling the environment, understanding how things change over time. He listened closely. It's not so different from basic observation, the researcher continued. If you see something happen again and again, you start to find ways to guide it. Guide it. That word stood out. It suggested intention, not just reaction. He wrote it down quickly. As the conversation continued, they discussed natural substances used in ancient times. Some were simple salts. Others were plant-based mixtures. Each had a role, even if it was small. None of it felt random. Everything pointed to learning through experience, trial and error. Over time, those small lessons became habits, and those habits became customs. When he left the research space, he felt a deeper sense of connection to what he was studying. It was no longer just about what people did. It was about how they learned. That evening, he sat outside again, not far from a river. The air was cooler now, and the sound of water moved gently in the background. He opened his notebook and began to write, not just notes this time, but thoughts. He wrote about how each custom seemed to come from a real need, how shaving reduced discomfort and risk, how oil protected the skin and kept insects away, how headrests improved airflow and durability, and now, how preservation methods helped manage the effects of heat and time. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. But something else was starting to appear as well, a pattern of thinking. Ancient Egyptians were not just reacting to problems. They were observing, testing, and improving their solutions. They were paying attention. That realization changed the way he looked at everything. The next day, he returned to the records with a new question in mind. Not just what did they do, but how did they figure out? He searched for repeated ideas, similar methods described in different places. He looked for signs of change over time, small improvements that showed progress. And he found them. In some notes, the use of certain oils became more refined. In others, tools appeared more shaped, more effective. Even the descriptions of daily routines became more structured. It was subtle, but it was there. Growth, learning, adaptation. He felt a quiet sense of respect build inside him. These were not people following fixed rules without thought. They were problem solvers, careful observers of their environment. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining what daily life might have felt like. The heat pressing down during the day, the constant need to stay clean, the effort required to manage simple tasks. Nothing came easy, and yet they found ways to make it work. Not perfectly, but effectively. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed something he hadn't paid much attention to before. The balance between simplicity and effort. Many of their solutions were simple in design, but they required discipline to maintain. Regular shaving, consistent cleaning, careful use of materials. These were not one-time actions. They were habits. That meant people had to commit to them, day after day. That level of consistency said a lot. It showed that these customs were not just useful. They were trusted. That trust came from results. If something works, people keep doing it. If it doesn't, they change it. That simple idea connected everything. Over the next few days, he focused on confirming what he had started to understand. He cross-checked information, compared sources, and asked more questions. Each answer strengthened the same conclusion. There was logic behind these customs. Clear, practical logic. But what surprised him most was how often that logic had been overlooked. Maybe it was because the practices looked unusual. Maybe it was because people focused too much on larger historical events. Or maybe it was simply easy to label something as strange than to take the time to understand it. Whatever the reason, it had created a gap, and he had stepped into it. One afternoon, while reviewing his notes again, he noticed how much his perspective had changed. At the beginning, he had been curious. Now he felt responsible. Responsible for telling the story the right way, not as a list of odd habits, but as a system of smart choices, not as something to be judged, but something to be understood. He looked at the pages spread out before him. They were no longer just records. They were evidence. Evidence of thought, effort, and awareness. He picked up his pencil and began to organize his ideas more clearly. First, the environment. Then, the problems it created. Then, the solutions people developed. And finally, the habits that kept those solutions in place. It formed a simple structure, easy to follow, easy to explain, but powerful in meaning. As he worked, he realized something else. This was not just about the past. It was about how people think, how they respond to challenges, how they learn over time. Those patterns were still present today, just in different forms. That thought made the story feel even more important. It was not just historical. It was human. That night, as he closed his notebook, he felt a sense of progress that was different from before. Not just excitement, clarity. He had moved past the surface, past the first impressions, into something deeper. And there was still more to uncover, more connections to make, more understanding to reach. But now he had a foundation, a clear way of seeing things. He turned off the light and sat in the quiet for a moment. The room felt still, but his mind was active, not restless, focused. He knew the next steps would take more effort, more time, but he was ready. Because now, he wasn't just searching for answers. He was following a pattern, one that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The days that followed felt different, not because the work had slowed down, but because his thinking had changed. He was no longer just looking at the past. He had started to compare it with the present, almost without realizing it at first. It began with something small. One morning, while getting ready to leave, he noticed a bottle of lotion sitting on the table. He had bought it a few days earlier because the dry air had started to affect his skin. Without thinking much, he picked it up, used a small amount, and placed it back. Then he paused. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at it. Natural oils, skin protection, preventing dryness. It was not very different from what he had been studying. The thought stayed with him as he stepped outside. The sun was already strong, and people moved quickly along the streets, some covering their heads, others wearing light clothing to stay cool. Adaptation. It was everywhere. But most people didn't think about it. They just did what worked. That realization followed him through the day. Later, while sitting in a small cafe, he watched as someone nearby applied a spray to keep insects away. A simple action, done without much attention. Again, a connection appeared. Different time, different tools. Same idea. He leaned back in his chair, letting the thought settle. What he had been studying was not just history. It was a pattern that continued into modern life. People still solve problems in similar ways. They just used different materials, different methods, but the logic remained the same. That afternoon, he returned to his notes and began to organize them in a new way. Instead of grouping them by ancient practices, he started pairing them with modern equivalents: shaving and hygiene, oils and skincare, insect protection, sleeping arrangements. The more he compared, the clearer it became. The gap between past and present was not as wide as it seemed. In some cases, it was almost invisible. He found this both surprising and strangely comforting. It meant that people, no matter the time, faced similar challenges, and often they found similar solutions, just shaped by the tools they had. He spent the next few days exploring this idea further. He visited a modern research center where studies on natural products were being conducted. The place was clean, organized, and filled with equipment that looked far more advanced than anything from the past. But the purpose felt familiar, understanding how natural substances could help the body. He spoke with a researcher there, explaining some of the ancient practices he had been studying. The researcher listened with interest, then nodded. A lot of what people are using today has roots in older knowledge, the researcher said. Sometimes we rediscover things that were already known, just explained differently. That sentence stayed with him. Rediscover. It suggested that knowledge was not always lost. Sometimes it just changed form. He thought about how many ideas might have been forgotten simply because they were not written in a way that modern people understood, or because they looked too simple to be important. That evening, he sat by the window in his room, looking out at the city again. The lights, the movement, the constant activity, it all felt alive. But beneath that, there was something steady. The same needs, the same challenges, the same search for comfort and balance. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. People have not changed as much as we think. He stared at it for a moment, then underlined it. The next day, he decided to take a break from the usual research spaces and spend time simply observing. He walked through markets, small streets, and quiet areas where daily life moved at its own pace. He paid attention to small actions. People choosing shade instead of direct sunlight. Vendors keeping their goods covered to protect them from heat. Workers taking short breaks to avoid exhaustion. Everything had a reason. Everything was shaped by the environment. It reminded him of the patterns he had seen in the ancient records. Different setting, same thinking. At one point, he stopped near a small shop where handmade items were being sold. Among them were simple wooden objects, some shaped in a way that caught his attention. They looked similar to the headrests he had seen earlier. Not exactly the same, but close enough to make the connection clear. He picked one up and examined it. Smooth surface, curved top, solid base. The shop owner noticed his interest and smiled. Good for support, the owner said. Simple, but works. He nodded, placing it back carefully. Simple, but works. That idea seemed to follow him everywhere now. Later that afternoon, he returned to his room and reviewed everything he had gathered so far. The notes had grown into something much larger than he expected. They were no longer just observations. They were connections, links between past and present, between different ways of solving the same problems. He began to shape his thoughts into a clearer message. Ancient customs were not just traditions. They were solutions, and many of those solutions still existed today, just in updated forms. The more he worked on this idea, the more confident he became. It felt solid, real, not forced, but he also knew there was a deeper layer to explore, something beyond just practical comparisons. He thought about how modern people often see progress. Newer is better. More advanced means more effective. But his research suggested something different. Sometimes, older methods were just as effective. Sometimes, they were even better in certain situations. That didn't mean going backward. It meant understanding what worked and why, then choosing the best approach. That balance felt important. He wrote more notes, focusing on this idea. Understanding over judgment, learning instead of dismissing, respecting knowledge, no matter where it came from. As the evening turned into night, he felt a sense of direction forming. This part of the story was not just about explaining ancient customs. It was about showing their relevance, showing that they were not disconnected from modern life, but part of a continuous line of human thinking. He closed his notebook and sat quietly for a while. The room was still. The city outside had begun to slow down. And in that quiet moment, he realized something simple but powerful. The past was not as distant as it seemed. It was still present, in habits, in choices, in the small ways people adapted to their surroundings every day. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out once more. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the lights and buildings, the Nile continued its steady flow, just as it had for thousands of years. Constant, reliable, a reminder that while time moves forward, some things remain connected. He returned to the table and placed his notebook neatly on top of the stack of papers. There was still one more part of the story to shape, one more step before everything came together. But for now, he felt ready to take everything he had learned and turn it into something clear, something meaningful, not just for himself, but for anyone willing to see beyond first impressions, anyone willing to look at something strange and ask a simple question: what if it makes sense? With that thought in mind, he turned off the light and let the room fall into darkness, knowing that the next step would bring everything into focus. The final days of his stay arrived quietly, without any big moment to mark them. There was no sudden discovery, no dramatic turning point. Instead, everything felt steady, like pieces of a puzzle finally settling into place. He woke up earlier than usual that morning. The room was still dim, with soft light just beginning to show through the window. For a moment, he stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting his thoughts move slowly. It had been a long journey, not just in distance, but in understanding. When he first arrived, he was looking for something small, something easy to miss. He thought he might find a detail that others had overlooked, but what he found was much bigger, a different way of seeing. He sat up and reached for his notebook, which now felt heavier than before, not because of its weight, but because of everything it carried. Notes, sketches, questions, ideas, and most importantly, connections. He flipped through the pages slowly. Each section reminded him of how his thinking had changed. At the beginning, there had been confusion. Simple questions like, why would anyone do this? Filled the margins. Now, those questions had been replaced with clearer ones. What problem were they solving? How did they figure this out? Why did it work? The difference between those two ways of thinking felt important. One judged. The other tried to understand. He closed a notebook and placed it carefully on the table. Today was not about gathering more information. It was about bringing everything together. Later that day, he found himself in a quiet hall where a small group of people had gathered. It was not a large event, just a simple space where ideas were shared and discussed. Some were researchers, others were students, and a few were simply curious listeners. He stood near the front, holding a few pages of notes. He had gone over them several times, but now that he was here, he felt calm, not nervous, not rushed, just ready. When it was his turn to speak, he took a small breath and began. He did not start with facts or dates. He started with a question. Why do we think something is strange? The room stayed quiet, people listening closely. He continued, speaking in a clear and steady tone. Sometimes we see something from the past and decide it doesn't make sense. We call it unusual or unnecessary or even wrong. But often, we don't stop to ask why it existed in the first place. He paused briefly, letting the idea settle. Then he began to share what he had learned. He talked about the shaving practices, explaining how they help manage heat and hygiene. He described the use of oils, not just as decoration, but as protection for the skin and a way to deal with insects. He mentioned the headrests, how they were designed for airflow and durability rather than softness. And he spoke about the early preservation methods, explaining how they help people manage the effects of time and environment. As he spoke, he kept his words simple. No complex terms, no heavy explanations, just clear ideas, one after another. But what made the difference was not the information itself. It was the way he connected it. These were not random customs, he said. They were solutions. People were observing their surroundings, facing challenges, and finding ways to deal with them. He looked around the room, making sure his message was clear. They were thinking just like we do. There was a quiet understanding in the space now. People were no longer just listening. They were considering. He continued, moving into the next part of his thoughts. He explained how many of these ideas still existed today, how modern products and habits often followed the same logic, different tools, different materials, same purpose. We protect our skin, he said. We keep ourselves clean. We find ways to stay comfortable in heat. We use products to keep insects away. He gave a small pause. These are not new ideas. They're old ideas still working. A few people nodded. The connection was clear. He could see it in their expressions. Then he moved to his final point. Not about the past. not about specific customs, but about thinking. Maybe the real lesson here is not about what they did, he said. Maybe it's about how they thought. He placed his notes down on the table beside him. They paid attention. They learned from what they saw, and they kept what worked. His voice remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in his words. We can do the same. The room stayed silent for a moment after he finished. Not an empty silence, a thoughtful one. Then came a few questions, simple and direct. People asked about specific customs, about how certain ideas were discovered, about whether similar patterns existed in other parts of the world. He answered each one carefully, staying honest when he didn't know something and clear when he did. The discussion felt natural, open, not forced. When it was over, a few people stayed behind to talk. Some shared their own thoughts. Others mentioned things they had noticed in their own lives that now felt different. That was the part he appreciated the most. Not just sharing information, but seeing others start to think differently. Later that evening, he walked alone through the streets one last time. The city felt familiar now. Not new, not overwhelming. Just another place where people lived, adapted, and made choices based on their needs. He passed by small shops, quiet corners, and open spaces where people gathered. Everything moved at its own pace, shaped by the same basic ideas he had been studying. Comfort, balance, practicality. He reached a spot where he could see the river again. The water moved steadily, just as it had every day since he arrived. He stood there for a while, watching it, let his thoughts settle. It felt like everything had come full circle, from a quiet room filled with old papers, to a deeper understanding of how people lived, and finally, to a simple realization. The past was not strange. It was familiar. It only seemed strange when it was not understood. He smiled slightly at that thought. It felt simple, but it carried weight. He turned and began to walk back. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to chase. Only one thing remained, to carry this understanding forward. To remember that behind every habit, every custom, every action, there is usually a reason. And sometimes all it takes is a closer look to find it. Back in his room, he packed his things slowly. The notebook went into his bag last, not because it was the most important object, but because it held the most meaning. He looked around the room one final time. It had been a place of questions. Now it felt like a place of answers. Before turning off the light, he paused for a moment. There was one last thought that came to him, clear and steady. Maybe the real value of history is not in what it shows us about the past, but in what it teaches us about ourselves. He nodded slightly, as if agreeing with that idea. Then he turned off the light and let the room go quiet. Outside, the city continued, just as it always had. And somewhere beyond it, the river flowed on, carrying time forward, just as it always would.